In the passage that Ria read to us, Mark tells us that wonderful story in which Jesus, after traveling for some time throughout Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and healing the sick, he returned to Capernaum. And the news of his return spread very quickly, and so many people came to the house where Jesus was staying that day. There were so many people, so there was no room even in front of the door. And the Bible does not tell us who the house belonged to, but the researchers believe that it was the house of Peter. And so many people had flocked to it, and Jesus proclaimed his message there again. The town of Capernaum, or as the New Translation calls it, Capernaum, was a city in Galilee on the northwest shore of the lake, close to the mouth of the river Jordan. In the Old Testament, this place is not mentioned at all, and therefore it is assumed that this place was only built after the Israelites had returned to their land from their exile. The city was important because it was located on the large and important trade route from Syria to Egypt, and still exactly on the border of the empire of Herod Antipas. And that is why there was also a Roman occupation in this city, and there was a Roman toll house with many tax collectors. Mark tells us in the passage we have read about a paralytic man who is brought to Jesus by friends. And I guess they must have been very special and faithful friends, because when they came there near the house, there was no way for them to get through with a stretcher. And instead of giving up, we can't get to it, let's go back. No, they were cunning and clever. They went up on the roof, opened up a part of the roof, and lowered the stretcher with their friend on it to the feet of Jesus. That seems very drastic. To just make a hole in the roof. I don't think any one of us would let someone just make a hole in the roof. But it wasn't as catastrophic as it sounds. The houses at that time and in that region did not serve as our houses do, to live in them and to stay there all the time. But in that wonderful climate, where everyone stayed outside as much as possible, the houses were mainly used to sleep in them and to store their utensils and their storage. Only in bad weather, people retreated to the house, but otherwise they lived mostly out on the street. But you see that in more countries even now. And that is why the houses there didn't have too high requirements. Most houses, therefore, had only one room with few doors and windows. And because trees were scarce in Palestine, little wood was used. The houses were mainly built of natural stone, supplemented with clay or brick, that is, bricks and tiles of clay, dried in the sun or hardened in the fire. The roofs were usually flat, formed by laying rough tree trunks on the walls, after which the space in between was filled with a wicker work of branches and loam. So apparently it was not that difficult and drastic for those friends, the friends of the paralyzed man, to make a passage in the roof and lower their friend down. That hole could therefore be closed very easily. Those houses at that time usually had a staircase on the outside of the house that led to the roof. So it was not that difficult for them to go to the roof with that stretcher. I can recognize a little bit of this because I lived in Mexico, and a lot of the houses there had a flat roof with stairs on the outside and on the flat roof there was a room for the maid. We didn't have that. We had that room, but we used it as storage. But a lot of people had a maid there or a servant. So I recognize a little bit how the houses were. Jesus, seeing all this happen, was moved by the faith and the love of the friends, and he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And the way the Jews thought at that time, it was the case that sickness was the result of sin. If you had sinned, you were sick. You could become sick. Therefore, we can safely assume that the paralytic man had a silent fear that his sins would interfere with his healing. Jesus was also a Jew, so he knew the train of thought and was therefore the first to say that the man's sins were forgiven. And one thing becomes very clear to us this morning, namely that our faith can have a lot of influence on what happens to someone else. Our faith can have a lot of influence on what happens to someone else. Through the faith of the friends, the paralyzed man was forgiven of his sins. That came first. Healing of his sins, and the healing followed, the forgiveness of his sins and the healing followed later. But, as I said, the most important thing was that his sins were forgiven first. And it appears that not everyone was happy about what happened there. Some scribes said to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And Jesus heard them, and understood what they were thinking in their hearts. And he responded, and we read it already, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." That made a big impression. I'm sure of that. So people were filled with awe and praised God. I could say a great deal this morning about those 4 friends who made sure that their paralyzed friend would come to Jesus at all costs. But I also want to say something about the crowd of people that was around Jesus. So many people had gathered around Jesus that the paralyzed man could not reach them in a normal way. We can see a similar situation in the event of the tax collector Zacchaeus. This man had a dubious past. He enriched himself at the expense of the people who had to pay tolls or taxes. And from Zacchaeus' story, you can conclude that he was very concerned about it and wanted to be freed from his past. He knew that he had to go to Jesus for that. But in this situation too, he was confronted with the same thing as the paralyzed man. He could not reach Jesus. The people had gathered around Jesus in such a way that there was no getting through. But, like the 4 friends, Zacchaeus also looked for a solution. He really wanted to see Jesus, and he also took a very unorthodox measure. He climbed a tree so that he could see Jesus when he passed by.